So good evening, everybody. I'm Sally Shuttleworth, Head of the Humanities Division. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight to the first keynote lecture in our new series of Humanitas Visiting Professorships. We're going to have 10 visiting professorships in a range of areas, bringing leading practitioners and scholars to the university in classes and lectures which are open to both members of the university and the wider public. We're deeply indebted to Lord Weidenfeld, whose vision and energy have made the whole venture possible. And I'd also like to give our thanks to Eric Abraham, who's not only sponsored this chair, but worked closely with us on all details of the programme. I could not think of a better figure to inaugurate the series of Humanities Professorships than our first visiting professor of drama, Athol Fugard, one of the leading political dramatists of our age. At a time when we all need to defend the arts and humanities, I can think of no better example than the outstanding career of Athol Fugard, representing the power of theatre to influence not merely individual lives, but the shape of nations. Starting in the late 1950s, his work in acting, writing and directing has helped transform not only the cultural and political environment of his native South Africa, but also political theatre across the globe. The power of those early plays, from Blood Knot from 1961 through to The Island and Master Harold and the Boys, has remained undimmed right through to his latest play, now playing at the Hampstead Theatre, The Train Driver. This has been greeted by great acclaim by the critics, the Daily Telegraph even suggesting that it's a work of rare grace, tenderness and fragile hope. Now, this is not the first event we've had this week with our wonderful new humanities professor. He's entertained us in series with playwrights. We've had screenings of films. There was a trip to the Hampstead Theatre to see The Train Driver with question and afterwards. And last night we had a most extraordinary event, I think. Athol, in conversation with his collaborator John Carney and Janet Boozman, talking about the difficulties and also, I think, the triumphs of managing to create political theatre under apartheid. And then the difficulties facing them once Nelson Mandela came into power. What do you do when, as John put it, the rhetoric of freedom is suddenly transformed into that very complex and difficult thing, the rhetoric of democracy, with all its possible permutations and compromises. Tonight, I hope that Athol Fugard will enlighten us a bit further and reflect not merely on those early days, but also on his entire career of 50 years of writing for the theatre. So I'm delighted to welcome Athol Fugard.
Thank you. Thank you. I cannot avoid starting, of course, without expressing my gratitude to Oxford University, to Lord Weidenfeld and to Eric Abrahams for what has been a remarkable experience for me. The past 3 days, or 4 days, was it? I don't know, 3 days, time seems to have stopped. I just lurched from one encounter to another, but each and every one of them has left me powerfully enriched. I can't tell you, and I think I can't say anything more higher praise of my time spent here than it has left me in the right way, eager to return to the table waiting for me in Southern California, San Diego, where there is a pen, a bottle of ink, and a lot of blank paper. And I just feel so enriched by this experience that I'm almost eager to start all over again. Anyway, so thank you. Thank everybody. Thank you, Eric. I don't imagine Lord Weidenfeld is here, but I hope somebody will tell him that I said so.
Attend to the train driver.
Good. Now, I've taken liberties with this occasion. It's been billed as a inaugural lecture. Now, what I'm going to share with you, I don't think merits a title as lofty as that, but I hope you won't be disappointed. What I'm going to share with you are what I have called, for the purpose of this evening, defining moments. Moments in my life that have made me not only the man I am, but the writer I am. As I stand here talking to you, I am 78 years old. And the first defining moment of all came before I was born. And it was when I think I would be accurate in describing her as a semi-literate young woman from the Karoo, a desert region in the heart of South Africa, when she fell in love with a English-speaking jazz pianist in Port Elizabeth. The woman was Elizabeth Magdalena Potgieter, my mother, and the man was Harold David Lanigan Fugard, my father. The union of those two people irrevocably shaped me and my writing in two major respects. The man gave me one of the most powerful and wonderful tools a writer can have, the English language. And the young woman matched that gift with the soul of an Afrikaner. I am an Afrikaner writing in the English language. And I think that fact explains so much of my work. Prompted by that thought, I sat down, I think it was the night before last, and just went through the plays I have written and tried to count the number of the identity of the main principal male characters in my play. And I think without exception, every one of them had an Afrikaans name. And I think that says everything. That says everything. A good friend of mine, now dead, Jan Rabie, an Afrikaans writer, once said to me, having read one of my new plays, "Here Athol, jy het jou stukke geskryf voordat jy hulle, jy het jou stukke vertaal voordat jy hulle geskryf het," which means you translated your plays before you wrote them, meaning they should have been in Afrikaans. And I take his point, but of course there was before me another wonderful Afrikaner, a great, great storyteller called Herman Boozman, and he also wrote in English. As time went by, however, the union between my mother and my father also brought with it further birthday presents. My father, in addition to being the leader of Port Elizabeth's very popular orchestral Melodians, that was the name of his band, he was physically handicapped by the loss of one leg, and also an alcoholic. But in addition to all of that, also a wonderful storyteller. There used to be a time when he could spin a yarn as deftly as he tickled the ivories. That was more or less the language he used, spinning a yarn and tickling the ivories. Many were the candle-lit hours in the middle of the night when, as a still small boy, I tried to massage away the pain in the stump of his missing leg, only to be then later rewarded when the pain and the cramp had passed, with a retelling, in abridged version, of course, of all the wonderful books he had read in his youth. Call of the Wild, Hound of the Baskervilles, King Solomon's Mines. Music and storytelling. Could any young aspiring writer ask for better birthday presents? And then my mother, an Afrikaner, as richly, deeply rooted in the South African soil as any of our many other South African identities. But there was something more. By the grace of whatever God you choose to believe in, she was endowed, this simple woman from the Karoo, awesome woman was endowed with a natural sense of justice. And it was that sense of justice that led her eventually to look at the world around her and see what was happening to people in the world around her, particularly people of color, the coloreds and the Africans, and to realize, it led her to realize that there was something seriously wrong with the country, radically wrong. She passed those doubts and questions on to me when I was still a young boy. It was a shared comradeship that we had. And if I have to look back and find the moment when I first started questioning the validity of the society in which I was living, it goes back to those times when we sat together in the St. George's Park tea room and talked about the country, talked about our feelings. But there were, of course, other prejudices, other forces at work on that little boy. I mean, we weren't cocooned, we weren't sort of isolated from the rest of society. And that society, using all the many forces at its disposal, was also trying to influence me, trying to load me with the prejudices and the bigotries that characterized South Africa in pre-colonial times, and then, of course, most notoriously through the apartheid years. In other words, the end result was a very confused and conflicted young boy who was heading for his own personal defining moment. I waited for 30 years before I was able to tell the story of that moment, and I did so in my play, Master Harold and the Boys. It records how, in a moment of intense and agonizing loneliness and confusion, a time of divided loyalties, I spat in the face of the most beautiful friend I have ever had. And I could do that because he was black, you see, and I was white. So I could do it. His name was Sam Samila, and he and another equally generous African man, Willie Kuchuraringa, were family servants. Firstly, in the little boarding house my mother ran, my father's condition with his missing leg, his alcoholism, meant that it wasn't long before my mother became the breadwinner in the family. And then after that little boarding house, she acquired a little tea room in the St. George's Park. In writing this play, and that incidentally was the setting for the defining moment. In writing this play, Master Harold and the Boys, I tried very hard to portray as accurately as I could the remarkable spirit of those two men. Sam, in particular, his passion was ballroom dancing, and his passion for it, I discovered, was based on a vision of a better world than we found ourselves in. He tried to explain it to me as we sat in the empty tea room on one very wet Port Elizabeth afternoon. My school homework for that day was to write a 500-word essay, or as we called it, a school composition, on a local event of cultural or historical significance. I had decided in a very early demonstration of my capacity for defiance, for wanting to be different, to take as my subject the ballroom dancing championships in New Brighton, our main black township. Sam, who had competed in it many times, was helping me with it, giving me a vivid and colorful description of the event. The decorations and colored lights all around the scenery hall wall, the big jazz band on the stage, the master of ceremonies introducing the judges, and most important of all, the ladies in beautiful sequin dresses with their partners in tuxedos and tails out on the dance floor. At one point I asked him if a competing couple lost any points if they bumped into another couple on the dance floor. Both Sam and Willie, who also shared Sam's passion for ballroom dancing, had a very good laugh at my expense. And this was Sam's reply. There are no collisions out there, Hallie. Nobody trips or stumbles or bumps into anybody else. That's what that moment is all about. To be one of those finalists on that dance floor is like being in a dream about a world in which accidents don't happen. Little boy is deeply moved and impressed, and he says, Jesus, Sam, that's wonderful. That's beautiful. Of course it is, says Sam. That's what I've been trying to say to you all afternoon. And it's beautiful because that is what we want life to be like. But instead, like you said, Ellie, we're bumping into each other all the time. Look at the three of us this afternoon. I've bumped into Willie. The two of us have bumped into you. You've bumped into your mother. She's bumping into your dad. None of us knows the steps, and there's no music playing. And it doesn't stop with us. The whole world is doing it all the time. Open a newspaper and what do you read? America has bumped into Russia. England is bumping into India. Rich man bumps into poor man. Those are big collisions, Hallie. They make for a lot of bruises. People get hurt in all that bumping. And we're sick and tired of it now. It's been going on for too long. Are we never going to get it right? Learn to dance life like champions instead of always being just a bunch of beginners at it? Hallie, the little boy, again deeply moved. You've got a vision, Sam. Not just me, says Sam. What I'm saying is what I'm saying to you is that everybody's got it. That's why there's only standing room left in the Centenary Hall in 2 weeks' time. For as long as the music lasts, we are going to see 6 couples get it right. Get it the way we want life to be. That was Sam. Now, how else could I deal with the problem, the torment of wanting him, a servant, a native, a Kaffir? How could I possibly want him to be my father? Because I did. But I already had one. And though he was weak and a bigoted alcoholic and hadn't played the piano for a long time, and on every possible count he had failed me as a role model, I loved him. I really loved him. So I spat in Sam's face. Did he, in response, though, give me the thrashing I deserved? It would have certainly cost him at least his job because, how dare he strike a little white boy? No. Worst of all for me was not the physical blow I deserved but didn't get, but the look of deep pain in his eyes when he realized the damage I had done to myself. Not to him, but to myself. And he knew that in so doing, I was heading for a reserved and permanent seat on the park bench marked whites only. This was his response as he wiped my spittle off his face. You don't know what you've just done, Master Harold. It's not just that you've made me feel dirtier than I've ever been in my life. How do I wash off yours and your father's filth? I've also failed. A long time ago, I promised myself I was going to try to do something, but you've just shown me, Master Harold, that I failed. I've also got a memory of a little white boy when he was still wearing short trousers. We'd been exchanging memories, and this is his. And a black man, but they're not flying a kite. It was the old Jubilee Day. That was the boarding house. After dinner one night, I was in my room down in the basement. you came in and just stood against the wall, looking down at the ground. And only after I'd asked you what you wanted, what was wrong, I don't know how many times, did you speak. And even then, so softly, I almost didn't hear you. Sam, please help me to go and fetch my dad. Remember? He was dead drunk on the floor of the Central Hotel bar. They'd phoned for your mother, but you were the only one at home. And you remember how we did it? You went in first by yourself to ask permission for me to go into the bar, because I couldn't just walk into a bar. I'm a black man, Hallie. You went in first by yourself and got that permission. Then I loaded him onto my back. I went into the bar and loaded him onto my back like a baby and carried him back to the boarding house, with you following behind, carrying his crutches. A crowded Main Street, Hallie, with all the people watching a little white boy following his drunk father on a nigger's back. I felt for that little boy, Master Harold. I felt for him. After that, we still had to clean him up, remember. But he's your father. You love him, and you're ashamed of him. You're ashamed of so much. And now that's going to include yourself. That was a promise I made myself, Master Harold, to try and stop that happening. I move on, as did life. This venerable institution, Oxford University, good God, centuries older, is a good setting for my next defining moment. Is an appropriate place in which to share with you my next defining moment. Because it came in the third year at the University of Cape Town, where I was studying anthropology. They had been 3 very important and formative years in their own right, but it was a decision I took towards the end of the third one, which certainly merits the adjective defining. I can only describe as second grade the schooling that had led to me going to university. You will surely agree that when a passionate essay on butterfly hunting in the Amazon River Basin earns you a bursary to study motorcar mechanics, enough said. And I did for 4 years at the Port Elizabeth Technical College, which I did manage to survive, and which has since left me with a deep distrust of the internal combustion engine. Well, the less said about it, the better. It was my mother who got me to university. There she is again. She scrimped, scraped, and saved every last penny she could to get me there. She couldn't even afford the train fare from Port Elizabeth to Cape Town, so I had to hitchhike. You see, that young woman from the Karoo had come to the city with incredibly ambitious plans for herself. Marrying my father had abruptly put an end to those, because it was very soon obvious, and she realized it, that she would have to be the breadwinner or whatever, for whatever family lay in the future. So, as mothers often do, she invested her frustrated ambitions in me. I had to succeed and make my mark. And it certainly looked as if I was going to do it. A crop of class medals in my first 2 years in both philosophy and anthropology seemed to promise that. But while I was studying and genuinely enjoying my lectures, I had some marvelous teachers at that university, marvelous teachers. Professor Monica Wilson is a very famous anthropologist for people who work in that field. But whilst I was studying and genuinely enjoying my lectures and tutorials, another part of me by that point was playing very seriously with words on paper. At that time, mostly poetry, if I remember correctly. The writing of these words had been going on for quite a few years already. Perhaps it was that world without collisions that Sam and I tried to write about that was a sign of things to come. What sadly I can't remember is what it was that suddenly alerted me to the thought that the wonderful Bachelor of Arts degree that I would earn with the final examination, now just a few months away, was in fact a trap. Nevertheless, the realization that I wanted to be a writer possessed me so seriously for the first time and abruptly stopped my preparations for those finals. The decision I faced was quite frankly frightening, to leave university and see the world. That's what it's about. That is what writers are supposed to do, isn't it? The trouble was I had no one to turn to other than my mother, that wonderful woman who had invested all her frustrated hopes in me. For I knew only too well that she had. I needed someone then so much to give me courage, someone to say to me, do it. Fortunately, I knew where to go for that advice. And this is a true story. And it was just down the hill from the university, the Rosebank College of Music. It was in one of their soundproof booths that I listened to my then favorite, a recording of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. At the end of it, I had the courage to write a letter to my mom and tell her what I intended to doing. Writing her that letter, a letter in which I tried to explain what it was all about, what was in my head, that I wanted to leave university before getting my degree, then hitchhike from Cape Town to Cairo because, after all, you must understand, Mom, that is what writers have to do. They have to see the world. And her reply, then go and see it, Ali. Elizabeth Magdalena Potgieter. That was the measure of her. So I saw the world, or just about. I did reach Cairo, and that was followed by a spell on a tramp steamer, the SS Gregor, in which I literally sailed around the world, both canals, Suez and Panama. And writing? Oh yes. I was hard at it on number 4 hatch every night after my shift on deck. I was writing the great South African novel that would rival Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm. Mine was going to be the story of an ambitious young Afrikaans woman from the Karoo who came to the city, educates herself, and marries, and makes all her dreams come true. I scribbled away furiously every evening on a folding card table, and as I said, on number 4 hatch, as we sailed along. The climax came one night when we were anchored in a lagoon in Fiji, where we were taking on a cargo of sugar. I settled down with a bottle of gin to read what I had written so far. Drunk as I was eventually, by the time I reached the end, I still knew that it was very, very bad. So I threw it overboard. I watched a whole stack of pages just floating away. But it's also, I think, a little measure of a very important quality that has been, quality that I've developed, which is self-criticism. You know, starting to write and tell South African stories for the stage in that South Africa, the South Africa of that time. Well, it was, yeah, I had to rely on my own judgment. Now, what have I got? Drunk as over. There is no record of it, on my first attempt, other than that memory. But it remains for me a very important effort, and more than just a hint of what lay ahead in my playwriting. For if there's one thing in the 20 or so plays that I've written that I feel I am justified in taking a measure of pride in, it is the gallery of portraits of strong women that I have drawn over the years. Hester Smith, Millie Jenkins, Leona, Gladys Besaidenout, Miss Helen, Hildegard of Bingen, Veronica Jonkers, all strong, beautiful women. And they all owe their life well, whatever life you can think that characters in a play have, they all owe their life to Elizabeth Magdalena Potgieter, my mother. So it was a chastened but still determined young would-be writer who signed off when we offloaded that cargo of sugar in Greenock in Scotland. When I eventually got back to South Africa, I chose the one option open to me, my unshaken determination of writing my career still very strong and firm. I first freelanced as a cub journalist for an evening newspaper, and then eventually landed a full-time position on the news team of the South African Broadcasting Corporation in Port Elizabeth, my hometown. That eventually led to a position in Cape Town, and it was there that the next defining moment came along. Since I've been talking about strong women, I have another one to add to the list. But this time it's not in the realm of fiction, but that of very real life. Her name, when I met her, was Sheila Mary du Plessis Meyering, and she is now Sheila Fugard, novelist and poet. I know with absolute certainty, ladies and gentlemen, that I would not have been here with you tonight talking to you as a playwright, or as anything else, for that matter, if it hadn't been for her. She was a young actress when I met her, and was responsible for me realizing that there might be another option other than the prose and poetry I was trying to write. I knew absolutely nothing about theatre or the craft of playwriting. It was however impossible not to consider such an option, as I accompanied her on the usual round of auditions that go with the life of a young actress, and listened to her talking about the plays she admired and wanted to act in. What passed as theatre in South Africa in those days was just a bloodless reproduction of West End drawing room comedies and dramas with the occasional nod to a classic. It was in fact for an audition of Oedipus Rex, at which Sheila was trying for the role of Jocasta, that I was pulled out of the gang of boyfriends and husbands hanging around and made to audition for one of the old shepherds. She didn't land Jocasta, I landed the shepherd. To my astonishment and Sheila's, I got the role, and eventually also for my very first review. It appeared in the Cape Times and suggested that if I had hopes for a career in theatre as an actor, I should start by taking lessons from the gnarled old, crooked old stick I was leaning on when I shuffled on stage. It was Sheila, however, who put me through a crash course in the basics of theatre. My ignorance was truly appalling. There was no theatre in Port Elizabeth when I grew up, nothing. Equally important, however, to the playwright was the role I had unexpectedly landed. It meant that through the rehearsal period and then the 4-week run, I was given the opportunity to study the workings, the nuances of what is surely, if not the greatest, one of the greatest plays ever written, Oedipus Rex. It is then, and as a result of this first experience, no accident that so many of my plays, and I never set out to do this consciously, but so many of my plays tell a story within the parameters of the 3 unities. The Train Driver is a perfect example of that. One setting, real time, virtually, 2 characters, 1 plot, 90 minutes. 80 minutes in the case of The Train Driver. One of the many things that Sheila and I had in common, apart from what I've just shared with you, was a sense of the extraordinarily rich and important fund of South African stories waiting to be told, and how, with 1 or 2 minor exceptions, they were totally absent from the South African stage. We felt strongly that theatre should be representative of all the racial groups in our country, not a whites-only preserve, as was the case in those days. This led us to forming a small amateur theatre group in Cape Town, for which we both wrote one-act plays. We also directed and acted in them. We felt, however, that the real challenges lay in the faster and more dangerous climate of Johannesburg. I gave up the last full-time job I would ever have, and Sheila did the same. We bought an old Jeep station wagon and travelled north. Once there, a series of coincidences led us to the famous township of Sofia Town, which had been targeted at that time by the nationalist Afrikaner government as a black spot in a white world that needed removal. The bulldozers were already at work on Sofia Town when we got to know it. Most important of all, though, Sofia Town was the home of a group of young black writers, all of whom have gone to contribute to the foundation of black writing as it exists now in South Africa. Their names are legendary: Lewis Nkosi, Bloke Modisani, Can Temba, Nat Nakaza, to name just 4 of them who became close friends. We got to know them all, and with their encouragement formed a drama group which, apart from Sheila and myself, was made up of black men and women who had no experience of theatre but were desperate to use it to speak out about their lives and tell their stories. The powerfully gifted Zakes Mokai, who eventually reached Broadway as a Tony Award-winning actor in Master Harold and the Boys, was one of them. When I first met Zakes, in the context of the Actors Workshop, the group that we had formed, he was a jazz musician in the Trevor Huddleston Jazz Band. And it was for this group that I wrote what I consider to be my first full-length apprenticeship play, No Good Friday, followed by another one, Nongogo. They still get staged from time to time in South Africa and have proved very useful in the training of young actors. This definitive experience led to a trip overseas where Sheila and I tried unsuccessfully to gate crash London Theatre. Both the Royal Court and Joan Littlewood's East End Theatre turned me down as a stagehand. It was Sheila who kept us going by working in a typing pool at Marks and Spencer's, while I, in addition to house cleaning jobs, returned to prose and wrote a novel set in Sofia Town, which I called Tsotsi. I saw the original manuscript again a few years ago. The bulk of it was handwritten in ink on the blank page, on the back of catalogues of Cyril Lord carpets, another of Sheila's typing jobs. And then one evening in London, during that period, it was a Bedsit Finchley Road, the landlord of our little Bedsit came upstairs with a copy of the evening newspaper. On the front page was the now famous photograph taken by Peter Magubane of the scene after the police had opened fire at Sharpeville. Sheila and I were shattered. A combination of that massacre and the impending birth of our daughter, Lisa, made us feel very alien in London and compelled us to send us back to Port Elizabeth and a very changed South Africa. My mother took us in during Sheila's pregnancy, while I sat down and wrote my watershed play, The Blood Knot. The play was a surprising commercial success in South Africa and suggested for the first time that South African stories did have a place on the stage, and that I might be able to earn a living, in fact, as a playwright. I might just add that I also directed and acted one of the 2 roles, while Zakes Mokai gave a quite extraordinary and definitive performance in the other. One of the happiest memories of my life in theatre is when Zakes and I recreated those roles on Broadway, on a Broadway stage 25 years later. The local success of that first production, however, was so great that the play actually made it to a London stage, that of the Old Arts Theatre. But in a classic display of misplaced erudition and complacency, Kenneth Tynan tore it to shreds. A very challenging experience, which I tried to deal with by returning home, licking my wounds, and settling down to write another one. The South African critics who had praised the play lavishly on its first appearance now proceeded to examine my failure overseas and give me the worst possible advice. I was too specific, they said, too regional. I had to realize that if I wanted to succeed overseas, I should write for a broad, general English-speaking audience all around the globe. Well, I'm sure you know that that is bad advice. Fortunately, my instincts got the better of me, and I ignored them. But the director of that failed London production was the American John Berry. He had been blacklisted during the McCarthy period and had gone into exile in France. He believed very strongly in the play and was determined it should have a second chance. That happened when he was able to persuade the First Lady of New York's off-Broadway theatre, the famous Lucille Lortel, and she deserves her fame. She was a wonderful woman, wonderful theatre personality. She persuaded her to produce it. John enlisted a wonderful cast for that first American production in the Cricket Theatre, James Earl Jones and J.D. Cannon. It was a huge success, and as to this day remained one of the regulars in the American regional theatre season. Apart from the unexpected bonus regular royalty checks, it finally led me to my first visit to New York. It was a very heady and very seductive experience. I was feted, invited onto a couple of TV shows, and the cherry on the top was that I moved into Miss Lucille Lortel's apartment, a flat at the top of the Plaza Hotel. Of course, it eventually all came to an end when I returned to Port Elizabeth and my family. That was as sobering an experience as the other one had been intoxicating. And in the first few weeks of being back, I had an experience for which I remain to this day most humbly and most profoundly grateful. It gave my life and my writing its major compass bearing. Whenever I think about it, I remember a poem by Kavafi, The City. I want to read it to you. You said, I'll go to another country, go to another shore, find another city better than this one. Whatever I try to do is fated to turn out wrong, and my heart lies buried like something dead. How can I let my mind moulder in this place? Wherever I turn, wherever I look, I see the black ruins of my life, yeah, where I've spent so many years, wasted them, destroyed them totally. You won't find a new country. You won't find another shore. This city will always pursue you. You'll walk these same streets, grow old in the same neighborhoods, turn gray in these same houses. You'll always end up in this city. Don't hope for things elsewhere. There's no ship for you, there's no road. Now that you've wasted your life here in this small corner, you've destroyed it everywhere in the world. In my story, the city is not Alexandria, but Port Elizabeth. Sheila and I were walking down the notorious Jetty Street one evening. We'd left our infant daughter with my grandmother so that we could go to the cinema. Oh, not my grandmother, my mother, my daughter's grandmother. It led to the harbour, this road, Jetty Street, led to the harbour and catered for the appetites of sailors who were looking for a good time. We were on our way to one of the two cinemas there. It was fairly crowded at the time. It must have been a Saturday night. And I accidentally walked into a very drunk coloured woman. The contact with her made me wince with disgust. In addition to the foul smell of alcohol and an unwashed body, her face was bruised with one lip split open and still raw and bleeding from a recent beating. Her dress was torn and one breast was hanging out in full view. She was quite simply, people were laughing at her and the foul language coming out of her mouth. At that moment, she was quite simply the ugliest human being I have ever seen, and epitomized what I saw as the sad and joyless world I had returned to after the glamour and bright lights of Manhattan. My immediate response was a silent but bitter, resentful voice within me. Are you all I get? Are you the best Port Elizabeth can give me? Another calm voice spoke up immediately. Yes, I am all you get, so love me. Yes, I am all you get, so love me. Not long afterwards, when Sheila, Lisa, and I had escaped from that Bird Street flat which was our first real home and which we shared with my mother, to the little fisherman's cottage in the seaside hamlet of Schoenmakerskorp, I made an entry in my notebook that was an echo of that Jetty Street moment. I have said, and this is the notebook entry, it was in August 19, I think Sheila and I worked it out, must have been 1963, 1964, something like that. I have said often enough in company, in interviews, that to leave South Africa on a one-way exit permit, because that is what the government wanted to do, they'd identified me as a dissident voice, as somebody who was making trouble within the state and would like me to get out of it. I've known it was so, but until this afternoon, I never felt out exactly what would be involved if I did leave the country. I didn't need to, I suppose, because it is the truth that to leave this country is unimaginable. Anyway, a walk with Osduck, that was my dog, in the bush this afternoon, ended up on a high sandy ridge, almost a dune, where the harsh grey scrub was cropped close to the ground because of exposure to the powerful southwesters that came blowing in. One was blowing at the time, long, clean, and cool. In the distance, the sea brilliantly blue and settling down after 3 days of rough weather. But it was that scrub underfoot, the nameless, deformed little grey bushes, half their roots exposed by the shifting sand. The thought that I might possibly one day never again walk over them in that silence, that innocence. There was a keen pain, an intolerable sense of loss at the thought. Then tonight, talking to Sheila, telling her that the idea had come to me yesterday at the stable, that my life's work was possibly just to witness as truthfully as I could the nameless, the destitute of this little corner of the world. That is what could be lost, those little grey bushes in the shifting sands of the dune. And so I ended my entry for that day in my notebook with a quote from the American poet Olson. I have no longer an excuse for envy. My life has been given its orders. The seasons seize the soul and the body and make mock of any dispersed effort. The hour of death is the only trespass. No longer any excuse for envy. My life had been given its orders. Love the little grey bushes. But to go back in time, we come to defining number 4. It was during the period when I was writing Hello and Goodbye after the success of Blood Knot that a knock on the front door of Bird Street flat one night announced the arrival of my next defining moment. It ushered into our lives because they had as great an impact on Lisa, my daughter's life, as they did on Sheila's life, and certainly on mine. Ushered into our lives 3 African men and 2 women from Port Elizabeth's main black township in New Brighton. Norman and Mabel and Chinga, Mulligan and Mkwana, welcomed Duhu, and Nomhle and Konyeni. They had read all about the local boy who had made good by writing a play called The Blood Knot, and had come to ask me to help them form a drama group. It was positively the last thing I wanted to do at that moment. When it comes to work, I have a one-track mind. Multitasking is truly something I am incapable of. I surrender myself totally to the tyranny of the blank page in front of me, and perhaps I was still smarting also from Mr. Tynan's attack. Through this, Norman and Chinga, as spokesman for the group, tried to explain to me how much New Brighton needed a drama group. Even as he was talking, I'd begun formulating my, sorry, but I'm just too busy at the moment, maybe sometime in the future. When Norman eventually ran out of words, Mulligan took over, and then Mabel, all of them in fact trying to add weight to their petition. But still, as I listened with badly concealed impatience, I realized I was listening to and witnessing a kind of hunger I'd never seriously thought about in the context of South Africa of that moment. A South Africa that was being silenced, gagged, suffocated by the draconian laws of apartheid. That such voices were desperate to be heard. They wanted to be heard. They just wanted to speak. I mean, can you imagine what that must be like? Not to be able to say or to talk about or to protest what is happening to your life, to you in your life. That was what they were dealing with. I'd never seriously thought about it by the laws of apartheid. At the end of the evening, I said I would think about it, and we agreed on another meeting a week or so later. It was really the result of my chronic inability to say no, my guilty white liberal conscience, that at the second meeting, I agreed to help them start a drama group. After thinking about it, I decided to adapt for our first production Machiavelli's The Mandrake, adapted to a New Brighton setting. And we were initially scheduled to give our performance in the abandoned snake pit of the defunct Port Elizabeth Museum. We decided, because of that, to call ourselves Serpent Players. The Cure, as we renamed Machiavelli's glorious romp, was a huge success. And what surprised me, however, that it didn't seem to satisfy the group. I had fully expected them to ask me to find another raunchy little comedy for our next production, but that wasn't the case. Norman once again took the lead in explaining that what the group really wanted was to do plays that were relevant to the many and real problems they faced in their daily lives. Lives which were being viciously circumscribed by the apartheid laws the government was putting on the statute books. Such laws which shackle their lives to the official stamps and endorsements in that much-hated passbook that they had to carry around, little identity document with their photograph in it, and the stamps in that book determined everything in terms of their life. You might have heard John Carney talking about it the other night. The stamp decided whether you could live and work in the city. Another stamp decided whether your wife could come to you or you could go to her. Every aspect of your life in that horrible little book. The Sharpeville massacre was started because a group of people had finally reached breaking point in terms of that horrible little book. And they had organized a protest demonstration in which they threw their books onto a fire and burnt them. And that was when the police opened fire. All right. I had no trouble, given what they had said to me, in finding the right play for our next production, Sophocles' Antigone. And their response to that timeless classic about rebellion against unjust law, edict, proclamation in the case of Creon, was exactly what they wanted. And why? Because they wanted to speak out aloud and be heard. They wanted to break through the conspiracy of silence that was strangling their lives. And what they had come to realize was that it was theatre that could give them a voice and that they could speak and truly be heard. For me personally, it was a lasting lesson about the role of theatre in a repressive society. It made me acutely aware of the moral obligation that I, as a playwright, had to face up to in the South Africa of that day. Serpent Players paid a heavy price for its political commitment. It wasn't long before the special branch was alerted to our existence, or as they saw it, the existence of a subversive New Brighton group who, under the disguise of doing plays, were in fact inciting people to rebellion. They suddenly started turning up at our rehearsals, staking names and addresses, confiscating copies of the plays we were working with, and eventually taking away members of the group, detaining them, who then disappeared off the face of the earth. 1 month, 2 months, sometimes 3 months, only to reappear later, 3 months later, in a remote courtroom where it was impossible to get defense lawyers to go and protest and handle the case. To appear in that courtroom before a biased judge, charged with trumped up charges, obviously found guilty, and bundled off to Robben Island. 5 of the group landed on Robben Island and kept near Nelson Mandela Company. And it was, in fact, a member of the drama group on Robben Island who, frustrated because he couldn't be there for the final event, which was the performance of Antigone in New Brighton, arrested before that. He was playing Creon's son, Herman, Sharky. He decided he would give a potted version of Sophocles' immortal classic in the prison concert at the end of the year. And he did, a 15-minute version of Antigone. Excuse me. And that led John Carney, Winston Chawner, and myself, a couple of years later, to devising the play, The Island, which ended up in the West End, ended up on Broadway, and was a massive rallying point within the country itself. I could go on and on and on because the catalogue of defining moments and their influence on me is a very long one. But I'm going to end with what I have called the defining moment that wasn't. And the defining moment that wasn't, because I thought it was going to be, was on a very hot day when Sheila and I were 2 of the people, of the millions of people in South Africa who took up their places in a long queue to go and cast our votes in our first ever free election. We were going to elect a government fully representative of everybody in the country. Nelson Mandela was already out of jail. The ANC was unbanned. It was a moment of unbelievable euphoria. I mean, come on now, has there been a drama? Maybe breaking down of the Berlin Wall, it was an event as huge as what happened to South Africa. To have turned our back, not by way of guns and bullets, they were there, but you know, they only pushed us a little bit. What really turned the corner in South Africa was men sitting around a table and talking, enemies talking to each other, dialogue, the theatre. Because that is what Nelson Mandela did. When he walked out of jail, having lost 27 of the best years of his life, he sat down with his jailers and said, let's try and work this out. I mean, you don't get it better than that. You don't get it better than that. And for me, that was surely going to be a defining moment. I mean, there it was. You know, what one had dreamt about. One had thought would never, never happen. And I was quite prepared to realize the price I was personally going to pay because of that moment was to be South Africa's first literary redundancy. I mean, what use was I going to, I had a bunch of tools that, knew how to make plays during the apartheid era. What about this new South Africa? You know, it was a time to pass on the baton and to a generation of new young writers who would take a different path, go a different way. And I really thought that. And I'd be free to maybe play with the novels that should have been written and the poems that should have been written. I don't know. I was prepared for anything in my life. It really was extraordinary. And I did go on to do one little private celebration of my own by writing a play called Valley's Song. A few years later, and it was a play in which I literally said, I believe in the future. And 5, 6, 7 years later, I was compelled to write a play called Coming Home. You know, Valley's Song is the story of a young girl in a small little village who's got a beautiful voice and dreams that the new South Africa, with the new opportunities it offers to everybody, she dreams that she's going to leave this little village and go to the city and make a success of her life as a singer. In my second play, I send her back to that village with a little child and AIDS. She has got AIDS and is dying. And I wrote that second play because by then a sense of betrayal, disillusionment had settled in. I can't believe that the audience I'm talking to tonight is not aware that things aren't too well, to put it mildly, with my country. That the degree of corruption, I mean, if you want a list of what is happening and what troubles me, we can start with corruption, we can start with the government's connivance with Mugabe in terms of what he's done to his people. South Africa could have put a stop to what has happened in Zimbabwe, to the brutalization of black and white by Mugabe and his police and army. We could have put a stop to that years ago. The most he got from South Africa was a slap on the wrist. It's so wrong, so morally wrong, what Mbeki and Zuma in his turn now have done as regards Zimbabwe. And now we're kicking out the thousands of Zimbabweans who fled into our country to look for shelter. We're shipping them back into Zimbabwe. There have been outbreaks of xenophobia in our country. Hard times. And what I realize, and that is my last note tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is that the new South Africa tragically needs the vigilance of writers, every bit as much as the old one did. Thank you.